A few weeks back, I made a rant video about my disdain of Maliss, and people were pretty divided over what I had to say. A big talking point in the discussion is how I felt that the Maliss board was not breakable. It was just an unmanageable amount of resources and disruptions met with a lot of follow-up, which to me felt like a recurring problem of last year with Yubel and Snake Eyes. And while my opinion on that matter hasn't changed that much, there were many people in my comment section saying that I was a hypocrite for disliking Maliss when Ryzeal Fiendsmith was in some way pretty similar, being very strong with very good endfields and good follow-up. That is true, and also further exacerbated with the release of Eclipse Twins and Supreme Darkness, which further makes the field stronger, as well as it gives the deck even better follow-up. And you can do this all with just a Bonfire or an Ice Ryzeal. And in many ways, that feels just like Snake Eyes, the extension being relatively simple, where, if Ice gets impermed, summon Sword. My reason for protecting Ryzeal, or rather, not hating it to the same degree that I would these past decks, is to me playing the Ryzeal mirror match, it felt more manageable. Largely in part, when you had X Ryzeal on the backswing, after you were able to weaken your opponent's field even slightly, the game felt somewhat winnable. X Ryzeal into Mirror Logic Aggregator was, and still is, a powerful enough interaction point going second that it makes specifically Ryzeal mirror matches more tolerable. And because there are still some clear choke points in the Ryzeal deck, like Duo Drive, if your deck is strong enough, you can weaken their field in a specific way that lines up with your strategy. That all made me appreciate Ryzeal a little more because it felt like it had actual silver bullets, it had weaknesses, it had a way to exploit it and get something from it. However, the more I have been exploring other decks, rogue decks in the formats, or even trying to make a budget Blue Eyes deck, I'm finding myself more and more faced with this problem of Ryzeal is frustrating. I understand why a lot of people have this opinion that Ryzeal is no better than Maliss. The truth is, it feels like Tear in some sort of way, and it's a big reason why I have a complicated relationship with Ryzeal. It has good aspects to it, but also still has flaws that mean it probably won't be remembered as one of the best formats of all time, best decks of all times, or that fondly in general. And the thing that I think makes it somewhat related to Tear is the aspects of the deck, the general gameplay mechanics, and the boss monster, in this case Ryzeal Detonator, are so overbearing that very few decks can keep up with it. The fact that extension is so free for the deck and every card replaces itself means that trying to engage Ryzeal in a grind game feels almost hopeless, and trying to prevent their field from happening is fine as long as you can deal with a Ryzeal Detonator. But Ryzeal Detonator is not a card that decks can just deal with. Ryzeal has X Ryzeal. X and Aggregator, as I said, deals with Detonator, which makes it not that hard to play into that mirror match scenario. And you can see when you're approaching Yu-Gi-Oh in that fashion, why that seems healthy. But when you are looking at this from every other deck, if I imperm Duo Drive and on my hand is Blue Eyes cards, I think to myself, I don't have a good way of dealing with this. I have to invest several cards of my board into the Detonator. Now the next solution is just make Typhon, but Typhon requires you to be extremely vulnerable to your opponent's non-engine cards, which in Ryzeal is pretty plentiful, as well as it shuts off your ability to do anything else afterwards. So all you're really doing is stalling for more time, at which point you have to back yourself up with defensive cards. You can't rely on engine to actually get you across the line. It means you have to have an engine that doesn't care about removal that much, or can somehow get the Detonator off the field quickly and efficiently, or you have to have enough non-engine that you can hold off your opponents in the way I said on the first turn, leave them with just a Detonator, but then also have the non-engine required to beat the Detonator. And for most decks, that's not possible. It requires an incredible amount of commitment to mathematically have hands that consistently deal with Ryzeal Detonator. That requires an absolutely enormous amount of hand traps. And then the other solutions is playing hand traps with breakers mixed, and you need to have enough of both that you consistently see both cards. And that's kind of what Maliss has ended up doing, where the Bestials can act as breakers, as well as cards of Metaltronus and Talons kind of amplify that, as well as a couple other hand traps to make sure that you can kind of prevent the Duo Drive from going off. Maliss is an exception where it's one of the few combo decks that can actually play a large amount of non-engine. And that's the reason why it's probably the only other deck that can succeed in this format at a large scale constantly, no matter the pilot. The more I've kind of seen the format evolve with cards like Gravekeeper Inscription and Barrel from a Different Dimension, it's kind of showed me that if you dedicate spots to Maliss, similarly to how you beat Ryzeal, you could actually deal with it, although it still is very non-engine reliant. And that is a step in the right direction from where Snake Eyes and Yubel were, where it was just not possible. It kind of showed that Maliss only thrives in the way it does as good as it is the only other deck that can have enough non-engine to keep up, where non-engine is the most important thing right now. It just happens to be a combo type of deck that if you're not prepared for, because you're preparing for Ryzeal, which is the more popular and truthfully the better deck, then you're gonna get caught without a good answer. And as a competitive player, that's obviously frustrating, and that's why Maliss has been frustrating. You can't realistically do two things at the same time. You have to just hedge your bets on something, and it may backfire. And that's just not to say you can't edge out wins versus either Maliss or Ryzeal with the tech cards for the other deck, but it is significantly harder. And it leaves us in a format where Tear was so overbearing that you pretty much had to build your deck directly to counter Tear, or it had to be Tear itself. Nothing else could keep up. It would get suffocated under the raw power of the milling, the shufflers, and so on. The fact that you couldn't ever access your grave in a reliable fashion because of Dweller and the shufflers meant that most decks did not stand the chance. You had to play with just field effects, and Tear wasn't bad on the field by any means either. And it almost feels similarly with Ryzeal. Detonator pretty much says you can't play on the field. You need a way to deal with Detonator, or you can't summon cards, you can't use spells, you can't do anything impactful. And it's not like Ryzeal has no answer to graveyard effects either. It's not like it has this huge weakness. You know, Ryzeal Cross obviously demands an interruption because that does give you the safeguard from graveyard and hand effects, but also Abyss Dweller, a big problem I brought up before. That means you can't play a heavy engine deck that relies on graveyard effects and get there. And Maliss conveniently fits into a deck that can sometimes push with engine. It doesn't need the graveyard, which is a very rare breed. So it's curious to me that Fire King and Mermail have had even some success, given how the odds look to be so stacked against them, given Ryzeal's dominance. And this all leaves a weird taste in my mouth because I don't dislike Ryzeal mirrors. And Ryzeal is interesting in the fact that because of its flexible nature, we've seen several offshoots and builds of Ryzeal, with each having different upsides and downsides, weaknesses and strengths. That element to me is always cool. It always invokes a little more choice, decision. It's not just show up with a pure deck and it's it. However, all those other problems where other decks can't exist means that it can get stale really fast. Even if there's some creativity, there's not much. And that's obviously not a good thing for Yu-Gi-Oh! While my opinions of Ryzeal were better before, I am slowly starting to get a little bored of it. And I don't hate the deck, and I'm not trying to drive up animosity towards a detesting of Ryzeal. I'll be ready for the format to end. I don't want it to last forever, and I hope Konami does bring an end to it in a timely fashion, not just keeping it lingering around forever, because it does make other decks almost ineligible. I'd like to explore other themes, some other powerful decks that have come out over the past few months that can't exist without board presence, and Ryzeal makes it just not existent. Now, one other thing I'd like to add is in all these other formats where they've had very powerful decks, we complained, like Snake Eyes or Yubel, where it seemed too powerful. One important thing that I mentioned was you couldn't really deal with that deck with non-engine. You needed it because you had to get lucky and had to really have a lot of non-engine and hand traps to get there, but breakers wouldn't work, and even then hand traps wouldn't always work either. Ryzeal, at least if you're playing the Ryzeal mirror match, then non-engine can get there a lot of the time because your engine does at least something meaningful to close the gap and do the rest of the work when you're playing the mirror match, where again that wasn't the case in these past decks. That is where it's a huge improvement. But what that does still mean is we're driven by these formats that are incredibly non-engine heavy. So beyond just rogue struggling, it's even more so engine heavy decks struggle. That eliminates a huge amount of the archetypes and playstyles in the game, and I don't love that when that happens. Obviously that can just happen as a result of any higher power format, although it feels like we've had higher power close to tier 0 formats for almost 2 years now, ever since tier, with small breaks in between, but still for the most part really didn't have too many choices in the type of deck you wanted to play. And instead you really have to pick a deck that can fit in around 20 plus non-engine cards, and then a lot of success for your tournament is in how you chose these non-engine cards. And that way it feels similar to Zoo. where Zodiac was also like that. It was an over powerful engine that was present in many different variants. Mitsurugi Ryzeal, Draco Zoo, Infernoid Zoo, Fiendsmith Ryzeal. Still, all these could do well and win. If you weren't playing those engines, very few other decks could keep up. And then on top of that, the biggest key factors in their successes oftentimes is rather just the non-engine that the decks utilize. It's not the worst thing for a format. Again, I want to reiterate that this is still a clear improvement from Snake Eye and Yubel. And yes, those non-engines still matter too, but it leaves a very different type of Yu-Gi-Oh! Than many different formats have come in the past. If Ryzeal the reign ends in a couple months, I'll be happy. It'll be an okay format in my history books, and I'll be happy to move on from it. I'm just worried that the game will suffocate, and that if Ryzeal persists for too long, then we get stuck in a kind of Groundhog's Day of non-engine being the necessity to win tournaments, and Ryzeal mirrors being the be-all and end-all of the game. I know it's funny me saying this, the person who praises tier mirrors, but those were a bit more interesting, truthfully. But even then, I also was done with them by the time that February came of that year. I think nothing for too long is good. Everything must have its limits. So let me know what you guys think. How do you guys feel about Ryzeal? For me, it is a bit complicated. I often change my mind or my opinions almost event to event with the deck, where it's good for the game, bad for the game. I don't think it's too overtly one or the other. And I do think it has nuance to it. Yeah, I'm curious, engaging in discussions. Grain of salt though, please always try and be respectful to each other's and myself with opinions. I'm not trying to insult anybody or bash them. You shouldn't be doing the same. This is kind of just a discussion about the health of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the metagame, the decks, and to me that's interesting. Let's leave it at that. It doesn't have to become anything personal. With that said, have a good one. I'll see you later. Peace.